Professor Jim Cummins, when did you meet Tove for the first time?
In a way, I met her for the first time through her writing. I was working as a research assistant in the university where I did my PhD in this was 1976, and I came across a report that looked interesting. I had never heard of Tove before this. I knew very little about the Scandinavian or the Swedish educational context, but this report was like one of the best novels I've ever written. I couldn't put it down because it was just opening up so much insight into the relationships between the Finnish community and the dominant Swedish community in Sweden. And it was also highlighting the role of children's first language in their learning of Swedish. So on the basis of that report, I wrote to Tove, and then we stayed in touch over the next few months and exchanged papers and work that we had done. And then we decided to organize a joint session at the ILA conference, the International Association of Applied Linguistics, that was being held in Montreal that year. And so that's when I first met her face to face when we were on the same panel at the Applied Linguistics conference in Montreal. But we've stayed in touch and in close email contact and frequently face-to-face contact since then.
So that was 1970.
Her report with UNESCO was 1976. The ILA conference in Montreal was 1978.
Okay. Well, what do you remember the most when you think about Tove now?
Well, there are lots of memories, obviously, but one that stands out because it made such a huge impact on me was in the early 80s. We were both involved in discussions with the State Department in California, the State Education Department in California, about bilingual education. They had formulated a theoretical framework for bilingual education and were looking at implementing that across the state. So this would have been maybe 1982 or thereabouts. And we were at a meeting in Sacramento with people from the Department of Education. And then we drove to San Francisco, where the California Association for Bilingual Education was having its conference, and Tove was the keynote speaker at that conference. But in the car, we were being driven by the husband of somebody who was in the State Department, and he turned out to be an ex-military person from the U.S. Army, extremely right-wing. And Tove and he got into some heated arguments about U.S. foreign policies in Latin America and South America and elsewhere. And at the end of that conversation and car ride, Tove was very upset. And she rewrote the speech that she was planning to give. And next morning, she gave that talk at the California Association for Bilingual Education and laid it all on the line in terms of what the US was doing in terms of stamping out human rights around the world by overthrowing democratically elected governments and putting in dictators, and the atrocities that followed from that. And she made the linkage between that and the oppression of minority groups in the United States and elsewhere. This was probably a relatively progressive audience, but nevertheless, many of them were shocked. Probably about 40% of the audience walked out of her talk within the first 15 minutes of it because they were offended. As they should have been, because they knew nothing about what was happening in American foreign policy. The other 60% stayed, and Tove got one of the longest standing ovations that I've ever heard. So I think that highlighted several aspects of who Tove is. She's incredibly honest. She was one of the most honest and direct people that I've ever met, and she is totally committed to defending the rights of minoritized groups and oppressed groups, whether they be from the deaf community, linguistic communities, indigenous communities, etc. So she is somebody who's memory lasts in those communities. She is loved by people in those communities, and they have been dramatically influenced by her work.
Fantastic. Well, then, academically speaking, what kind of impact has Tove's research had within the international academic community?
I think a lot of the work that she has done has centered around linguistic human rights, and in particular, over the last 20 years, that notion has been a central theme running through a lot of what she has done. And she edited with Robert Phillipson, her husband, an encyclopedia of linguistic human rights, which was something that was extremely challenging to do because her health was not that great in over the last few years while they were doing that. And that work, I think, will stand as her legacy because it brings together many themes and threads that have infused her work and influenced academic discussion and debate about these issues. Again, it's work that's well known within the United Nations. It's well known by many indigenous communities. It's well known by the deaf community in Canada and many parts of Europe and elsewhere. So in terms of her academic reputation, it goes along with her reputation amongst activists and educators in many historically oppressed communities.
Your work, if we talk about you and your work is very well known and received in Sweden. Swedish educators are familiar with the iceberg model you have presented, and or the linguistic interdependence hypothesis that reveals the relationship of the first language to the learning of second language. Um, what is your relationship to Sweden?
Um, I think my relationship to Sweden is very good. I love Sweden. I love Norway. I love Finland. I love Iceland. I love all of the Scandinavian countries that I've been to. And one of the reasons is that I think there's a genuine commitment to human rights in most of the Scandinavian countries. There in Sweden has been one of the first countries to recognize the role of children's home language in their development. A considerable part of that was due to Tove's influence in the 1970s. But I wrote a book that was published about 5 years ago and was published in Sweden in Swedish. It's actually only in Swedish. There isn't any English edition, and I think that that gave me the opportunity to discuss with people from many municipalities around Sweden issues related to the education of immigrant background students. And I found a huge level of commitment uh, in terms of trying to work together with immigrant communities. Sometimes that commitment and those values find difficulty getting expressed in an effective way within the school context, because obviously implementation is quite challenging and it's also quite political. But I very much appreciate the opportunity that I've had to listen to educators in Sweden and to dialogue with them about how schools can become more humanitarian spaces and more equitable spaces for all children.
But the Finnish language in Sweden is losing speakers. And the government has put efforts into the revitalization of the language. But what message would you want to give to all of us struggling with saving the language? Or what do you think Tove would say?
I'm not going to really uh, speculate about what Tove would say, because she would say it much more articulately and directly than I would, because she knows the situation much better and she's lived the situation. It is her situation. But in terms of uh, what I would suggest thinking about is the fact that uh, saving a language or developing a language has got to be a partnership between parents and communities and educators. And so, one of the first things that, from an educational point of view and from a language policy point of view, all schools should be doing is giving accurate information to parents about uh, what they can do to help their children succeed in school. And when we're talking about Finnish speaking families, or families from other communities, either long term or more recent, then one of the things that has to happen if we want to maintain the language is there needs to be a focus, a planned focus on maximizing interaction in that language. Um, and that means also literacy in that language. One of the things that everybody can do, all parents can do, in terms of helping their children develop not just the language, but also the underlying conceptual foundation for doing well in school is spending time with them, interacting with their children, but also reading to their children. That has huge impacts on children's neurological development. It has huge impacts on their readiness for literacy in school. It has huge impacts on their affective connection to books. And if children are reading a lot, and ideally reading in the home language as well as they get older in Swedish, then they're well set up to do extremely well in school. And so that's one area that I think we should be thinking in terms of partnership, because when a student comes to school speaking, let's say Finnish or some other minority language, and they quickly lose command of that language because Swedish is the only language they hear around them. Then schools have, in a way, made children less than they are. Children have come to school bilingual or potentially bilingual, and they're leaving monolingual. And we see that all the time in cities like Toronto, where I work, where Toronto can accurately be described as a vibrant multilingual city. More than half the children in the school system come from non-English speaking backgrounds, but it can also be described as a linguistic graveyard. Languages come to school to die. Because in many schools, there isn't the support for the languages. Teachers are not antagonistic towards the language. They will support parents to the extent that they can in helping them maintain the language. But when you've got 15 different languages in your classroom, there may be limited things that you can do. And so under those conditions, we need to be very active as educators and in communicating to children that their languages are something to be proud of. They're an intellectual accomplishment. Multilingualism has always been characteristic of educated people, and we need to communicate that message to parents also, that they have a role to play in language maintenance. It's not going to happen by itself. And so the school and parents need to work together. Another thing that I would suggest that educators should be doing for themselves, but also communicating to their school leaders, the school principals in their school, as well as ministers of education, is to look at what happens when schools position themselves as being language friendly. And I'm talking here about a relatively recently started network or movement called the Language Friendly Schools Network. And the website is languagefriendlyschool.org. You can go to their website and you'll hear educators talking about how they have affirmed students' identity as multilinguals, how children are doing all kinds of projects focusing on the languages that they have as a school community. And it's incredibly inspirational. You look at these schools, hear the educators who are talking about what's going on in the school or visit these schools. And as parents, I know I said to myself, gee, this is a school I wish my kid had been in. And so there's lots that we can do, but it needs partnership and the community in a context where a language is threatened or a community is losing speakers. I think there needs to be a partnership between the schools and the community because both need to be involved in the process of continuing to develop the language.
Very important and very inspiring. Thank you, Professor Jim Cummins, for sharing these ideas with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.